Hi, welcome to another episode of Great Conversations with me, Nicola O'Donoghue. In this week's episode, I talk to Libby Mitchell. I absolutely love our conversation because we explore concepts such as grief, overcoming trauma, shedding identities, and finding your way back to yourself. I know that these might sound like heavy concepts, and I guess they are, but Libby introduces and explores them in a way that is accessible and relevant. We do talk about losing a parent at a young age and healing from an abusive relationship. So I want to offer an invitation to skip this episode to anyone for whom these topics may be upsetting or difficult. I could have chatted to Libby for hours. I was honestly so engrossed in our conversation. Enjoy. This is the inspiring Libby Mitchell. Libby Mitchell, welcome to Great Conversations. How are you?
Hello, I'm very well, thank you. I'm very pleased to be here today.
Oh, thank you. Honestly, I'm so grateful to, first of all, for giving us your time, but also for sharing your story. And I guess maybe let's just start there. So, who is Libby Mitchell? I'd love to know.
It's a good question, actually. And I think at the moment, I'm still figuring that out. And I'm 29 years old, but I'm in a better place now and understand actually who she is. So I think for me, I've come from a background of being in elite sport as an athlete, but also within academia. And now having just transitioned out of that, I'm really wanting to explore the kind of psychotherapy counseling world now and kind of have an impact within that space. So for me, my main aim and purpose is just to help people and really help people in a deep, meaningful way. So that's kind of where I'm at the moment within my journey and kind of training to become a counselor and psychotherapist and then hopefully specialize in different things. But right now, that's where I'm at with my life and my role.
That is so beautiful. So you mentioned a couple of things of where you'd been and how have you, if you don't mind, sort of taking us through from Libby age 5 to sort of now, like what's been your journey to sort of get to where you are today?
Yeah, it's been a long one. It's been a big journey, but a very, I guess, impactful one. So my kind of life started, the kind of elite sport arena of my life started very early on. So I think I was around 8 or 9 when I started competitive swimming. And actually, the main influence of that was my sister. I saw that she was swimming and I was like, that's really cool. Like, she's my older sister. She's a bit of a role model. And it was something that I really wanted to get involved in. So my mum and dad started taking me to training at 8, 9 years old. And I think by the time I was 11, 12, I was training 12 to 15 hours a week. So it was very full on from a young age. And swimming is one of those sports where it is an early specialization sport. So, you peak at a younger age in comparison to other sports. So you're required to commit more hours and time to it. So that was a lot of my life for 10, 15 years. So like I said, I started when I was 8 or 9. And I did that all the way through high school, sixth form college, university, my undergrad. And it was a really rewarding time, but it was also intense and it had its challenges because there was a lot of commitment involved. And at the time, I didn't necessarily see them as sacrifices, but there were a lot of sacrifices that had to be made. So my life was quite chaotic. I was getting up at 5 a.m. for training, going to training for 2 hours and then going to school for the rest of the day and then coming back from school to then go to training again for another 2 hours. And then there would be gym involved. And there was a lot of traveling, a lot of eating dinner, snacks in the car, on the way to training. So life was very hectic and it was busy, but I somewhat thrived in it. At the time, I thought I was thriving. I was achieving. I was doing well in what I was doing. And within the academic side, I was going from, my undergrad, then I did a master's, and then I started a PhD. So that's been alongside of the swimming career as well. So having that dual career has been quite intense.
That sounds like that is unbelievable. And as you say, that level of like, before we even get into the academic career, the life and the career of an elite athlete, like for a lot of people, they would have dropped off, they wouldn't have had the commitment and the endurance to keep going. And so I'm really interested, like, what was it that gave you that sort of stopped you from deciding, like age 15, I just want to go and hang out with my friends and do something else with my time rather than this sort of disciplined schedule. So, yeah, what was it about that life that it offered to you that was so important at that part of your life?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the first thing that comes to mind is like a sense of community. And I think when you're in elite sport, it is very much like being in a bubble. It's very protective in some kind of way, but also it can have adverse effects as well. And I think at the time in my life, so I'm sure we'll probably touch upon this if we talk about my journey as well later on, but my mum actually passed away when I was 13. So whilst that kind of chaotic crisis was happening in my life, swimming and school were my kind of certainties.
Mm.
They were that stability that I needed in my life during that very challenging and emotional time. And I think swimming for me was a supportive hub that
Mm.
allowed me to feel safe and feel like I had a sense of belonging somewhere. And I
Mm.
think for a 13-year-old girl who felt quite lost, after her mum's passing, that's what I really needed. And I
Mm.
think as the years went on, I almost felt to some extent like I was doing it for my mum. I was doing it for me, but I was almost that connection and that attachment to her that kept me within it. I think subconsciously, just having that supportive bubble was everything. And I really needed that at a crisis
Mm.
within my life. And that's why I think for so long I kept in it, because it allowed me that safety within my
Mm.
life.
Yeah. And that makes total sense. I mean, as you say, sort of losing your mum at such a young age, I can't even begin to imagine. And so it makes total sense that, as you said, you went to where it felt familiar and safe and where you belonged, and that was swimming. And so, as you, I guess, then you touched upon and you said so beautifully, you think now looking back that a part of why you stayed in swimming as long as you did was to honor your mum. And it must have been really difficult for you at the time when you were sort of deciding to take a step back from swimming. Like, I'm just giving it like everything that you've spoken about. I'd love for you to talk us through your journey of leaving that, because as you said, the elite sport and swimming was such an anchor in your life, and there was obviously a huge emotional connection. Like, how did you navigate? What was the time like when you decided to actually leave that and move on? Will you just talk us through some of the things that you really faced and then how you navigated it? What helped?
I think like these events, at the time, I didn't necessarily process that well. And again, it's only been the past 2, 3, 4 years when I've looked back during that time and thought, gosh, I didn't grieve that time in my life. I didn't, take the space and time that I needed to kind of leave that career behind. So I retired from swimming. I say retired because it was like a full-time
Yeah.
job. I retired from swimming in 2014.
Okay.
So I must have been around 23, 24. And there were a few reasons as to why I retired. I think the first one, and the main reason actually, was out of my control completely. And it was to do with funding and the lack of kind of financial support. Because although I was reaching like a national, international level, I wasn't on the main governing body funding scheme. So I didn't have any kind of financial support, logistical support from anyone. So I was kind of self-funding this sporting career, and, it got really expensive. And to continue that swimming career, it was a case of staying in academia almost to kind of get the student loans to help me fund swimming, which at that time was my main priority. And ultimately, it wasn't an option. I couldn't afford to go full time because a lot of the swimmers that are at that high kind of Olympic level are full time athletes, and they do have like external funding, but I didn't have access to that. So for me, that was kind of out of my control, and it almost felt like a bit of a forced retirement because I still somewhat had a bit of passion there, and I knew I could do better. I knew I could, push myself a little bit further, but actually I couldn't feasibly do it.
Mm.
But then also on the other hand, when I look back within that kind of year of retiring, I was completely burnt out physically, emotionally, mentally. And, I really started to resent the sport. I really
Mm.
started to resent the people within it. I really resented swimming. and I just didn't want to be involved in it anymore. And I think what helped me with that transition was having other things to focus on. So within that time, I was in the first year of my master's degree. So I knew I had another year to go within that space. So, it allowed me to almost, be focused on something else, have another outlet rather than kind of just sitting at home, twiddling my thumbs, not doing anything.
Yeah.
However, on reflection, I do think maybe the master's degree acted as a bit of a distraction. And what I needed at that time was the space to actually process, and grieve the identity, because the athletic identity was 15, 20 years of my life. Like, it was huge. And actually saying goodbye to that was and has been really difficult. Like, I still struggle with it a little bit today.
It's so interesting what you're saying about identity, and what you're talking to is something that we often do, isn't it? We don't give ourselves time to grieve. So we cling and we have these identities in our life that become who we are. And then I think I've got really curious about change and transition and what it is that makes it so difficult to change. And I think a part of it is this identity is, we become what we are, and then we don't know ourselves without that. And then we don't give ourselves time, like you're saying, to grieve that loss of identity, because we don't see it as such. It's like we've got to be constantly in motion. So we just move on to the next thing and move on to the next thing and numb ourselves to the discomfort or whatever it is that we might be feeling. So I love that you've pointed to that. You swap the identity of an elite athlete for an academic. And it's like you took one cloak off and put another one on, and then continued on the sort of path without giving yourself time to grieve. And I would just love like, because that is so common, and because I think we've got this fear around grief, this fear around endings, and like sort of how we transition through that. Like, what are some of the things that you look back now, or even now from where you are, that you can offer that helps with that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, grief. It's such a taboo, isn't it, in
Yeah.
society? Like, we don't like to talk about it. And I think ultimately it's a huge barrier, because we don't just grieve the loss of a loved one, say. There's the grief takes, has so many different forms in identity, in relationships, whatever it might be. And we're always grieving. We always are, there are certain things that are kind of like non-negotiables that we will unfortunately lose within our lives, or we will grieve. So I think there definitely needs to be more attention towards that within society, and actually how to manage that and how to kind of cope with it. But for me, it's been really interesting, because over the past 2 or 3 years, and I think one massive kind of support tool that has been life changing is therapy. For me personally, I realized that I didn't actually grieve properly. I didn't grieve my mum's death when I was 13 years old. I didn't grieve the loss of my identity. I think externally, I probably looked like I did, because I was still achieving, I was still socially engaging, I was still very kind of like a happy go Libby, but actually I hadn't processed it at all. But externally, I look fine. And I
Yeah.
think that sometimes what's quite difficult, isn't it? So for me, the past 2 or 3 years has been very imperative in this kind of like healing journey, I guess, because I realized that I didn't grieve. And actually, as part of that, it means I have to grieve now what I've lost 10, 15 years ago, which has been really hard and difficult, because the grief can feel so raw and it can feel like it happened yesterday. If we're talking about, say, the loss of my mum, there are still days where I feel like it happened last week, because at the time, I didn't have the internal skills to be able to cope with that at such a young age. And externally as well, that the support wasn't there emotionally at all. So for me, it's been a journey in the past 2, 3 years to kind of to process that. And I guess some of the practical tools that have helped me do that is one, therapy, specifically EMDR therapy. I'm not sure if you've heard of it.
I don't know if you know that I was in an abusive marriage, and when I came out of that, EMDR pretty much changed my life. I am so privileged that I was able to access that, because I don't know where I would be if I hadn't been able to undergo that. I think for anyone that's carrying any PTSD or trauma, it's a wonderful resource to be able to access. Yeah, so I do.
Definitely. Oh, I'm glad you saw a real impact from it as well, because I think it's like subtle shifts over time. That's when you start to notice it. It's not like any therapy. It's never, obviously there are therapies that are more immediate than others. You kind of see outcomes and solutions more readily than others. But I think when you're dealing with trauma, it can be really complex. And, for me, EMDR has been really helpful. However, and I want to make this clear to like the audience, that you don't have to go to therapy to see, big shifts within that healing of grief, of trauma, whatever it might be. So for me, I've done a lot of kind of mind body work as well. So like somatic type work. So I swear by breath work. Like I do a lot of breath work, a lot of kind of conscious connected breath work. And that's been really good for me. A lot of EFT, so emotional freedom technique tapping.
Yeah.
It's been really good as well. There is an app called Tapping Solutions, which I use, which has been incredible. And all these things are, not necessarily, well, you can get them free on YouTube. There are certain people that do them on YouTube, but they're a lot cheaper than therapy. And also just like living freely and being in alignment with my authentic self more, and actually having joy, having fun, allowing myself to do that, because that can be so healing as well.
I think what you're talking to, and I love that you're saying about coming into your body, because that was a huge part of it for me and for my journey as well. Like I was so terrified of emotion. I lived in my head. I would do anything to just not feel any form of emotion. And that actually stifled my ability to feel true joy as well. I didn't realize that at the time, obviously, because as you say, I thought outwardly everything was great. But there was just sort of this low level numbness because I wasn't truly embracing every single emotion. And I agree with you. I think that's what a lot of my journey and the route through EMDR and therapy has actually just been about, reconnecting to my body. So agree, conscious breathing is phenomenal. Also, I've started getting into yoga. I was always very reluctant. And do you know what? Just falling in love and understanding me and my body and being aware of what's going on, I think ultimately has just been so liberating, like you said, to feel free. That's helped me then live and find out who my authentic self is and who my voice is, because I've given space and permission for the emotions to show up. I'm not afraid of them anymore because I'm more connected to my body. And I'm more trusting of myself to be able to manage whatever it is that comes up and give myself whatever I need. And before I started on this journey, I wasn't able to do that because I was always in my head. I was always blocking.
I think every emotion that we experience is stored in the body. Like, our nervous system remembers those traumatic experiences. It remembers, certain events in our life where we struggled. And I think a lot of us nowadays in the society that we live in are in like survival, hypervigilant mode, where it's that kind of fight or flight. There's no kind of room, space, and capacity to actually feel our emotions because we're just on like high alert all the time. And society promotes that the world that we live in, unfortunately, a lot of the time, it kind of praises that type of state. And I think that's what I think is actually really important in this work and kind of acknowledging, is to be able to process trauma and the emotions associated with it and all those different things. Like, you've got to be in a safe place. And I think that's key. And that's where kind of the experts come in, because if you're not in that safe space, then there might be a tendency to kind of like re-traumatize yourself. So you've got to feel safe within your environment, within yourself, before you actually start to process those types of things, because it can actually have like an adverse effect. So, say if, for example, you weren't in a very healthy relationship, or you were living in a space where you felt like you were in that survival mode all the time, it's going to be really difficult for you to feel safe in your body to process what's going on or what's been suppressed for so long. So I think that's really key here, is that safety. It's all about that self-compassion, isn't it? Understanding that you don't have to be victim to what's happened, to you before. And I think for me, that's been a really big lesson that I've learned, is that Where the growth occurs is not staying within that victim identity or state. It's acknowledging what you've been through and actually then how you use that information to move forward
Mm.
and how you kind of allow that to grow, I guess, and become a better person and show up in the world more authentically. I think for me, that's been huge.
Yeah.
It's been really important.
Yeah. And I love what you're saying about self compassion and also trauma as well, because obviously you and I are sharing and parts and events that have happened that are traumatic. And there's also sort of day-to-day trauma. So I don't know if you've heard of, there's a guy called Dr. Bruce Perry, and he writes a lot about trauma. And I love his redefinition of trauma because he says that actually we should be looking at trauma with a small t, not a large t. So it's not necessarily all these catastrophic events. Like actually trauma is something that just knocks our adrenal system off balance. And the way that we live in society today with always on technology, in a lot of these workplaces that are truly toxic, that actually can be hugely traumatic for an individual. But yet we're just taught to suck it up and get on and, sort of not process these microaggressions, these traumatic incidences that happen day in, day out. And even that is what I'm talking about here, like giving space to process that. It's like the way somebody speaks to you in the office or bullies you or makes you feel. And then you just don't even give yourself 2 minutes to get that emotion out. Like, how many times did I want to literally punch a wall or go into the toilet and cry in work? But I didn't. I held it all in. And then at the end of the day, I'd go and drink like 3 glasses of wine and then that would be it. But as you said, the emotion's still in my body and didn't get rid of it in any single way. I just sort of pushed it down and pushed it down. And so it's even like the things that we're talking about now, just if people might be listening to this and they can't necessarily resonate with something big that's happened in their life, think about what's going on in the day to day and what you're carrying with you and the sort of the stress that's having on your body, and then how that's impacting how compassionate you are both to yourself but also to the people around you. And I do find that a lot of people are carrying a lot of small t trauma and they're not dealing with it healthily. They're not allowing space to, whether it be grieve, process, whatever you want to sort of label it. And that's a big issue. Like you can see society is in pain because of that, actually.
I completely agree. And I think the awareness piece is key, right? Of how to, because I think some people probably don't even realize that actually they are maybe experiencing these little cheat traumas. They don't understand what they actually look like or how they might be impacting their body. So I think the awareness element is really key of actually what might that look like to you and within your environment, how might that look daily, but also then how do you process that? How do you kind of gain support through that? I love the work of Dr. Gabor Mate, and I'm sure you've heard of him, but he does a lot of work around trauma and addiction. And he also talks about trauma, because I think with the word trauma, nowadays, sometimes it can be used out of context a little bit. Like, some people might go down to the supermarket and say, oh, being in that queue was so traumatic. It was so long. But
Yeah.
actually, like, there's definitely a difference there between trauma and how it's conceptualized versus how it's just used freely in society nowadays. But I think, what Dr. Gabor Mate says is about trauma is that it's not just the event that has happened to you, it's kind of a consequence of those events afterwards, the experience that you get after that event, but also what you haven't had during that event. So, for me, I'll use an example through my kind of experience with losing my mum. Obviously, that was a traumatic event in itself. But then what was absent, what was missing from that time was the emotional capacity and support to grieve her. So that's what was missing. It wasn't necessarily what happened to me. It was what was also missing, what was absent from that time. So I think it's one of those things that definitely affects more people than they think today. But I think we just need to become more sensitive to it as a society. And like you said, allow the space to process it and grieve, whatever it might be, and that to be accepting,
Yeah. Yeah, I
it's
really like that. What's missing and what was lacking. And I really think that nowadays what's lacking is the tolerance within society for emotions. There's always this, you're overly emotional, or boys don't cry, or all of those really sort of toxic sentiments that squash that. I also feel as if it doesn't have to be this big grand event. And I think that's where we go wrong as well. Just giving space for your emotion. It doesn't have to be this you dissolving in tears, incapable of getting out of bed and working with a therapist for months. Like, it actually doesn't have to be on that scale. It can literally just be taking a breath, but a proper breath into your stomach and activating your vagus nerve and calming your system that way. It can be going and taking a walk and just sort of appreciating nature, but to walk off whatever it is that's going through your head. If you can
Yeah.
talk to somebody, and like, that's what we're talking about. And I think the default and the way that people, and I'm totally also guilty of this, I'm not sort of lauding it from high above as a more conscious being, we don't give space to that. We just disassociate and numb. So I'm guilty of binge watching Netflix, opening a bottle of wine, doing some online shopping as a way of just sort of not dealing with the shitty day I've had, or,
Yeah.
how stressed I am, or, just I'm absolutely as guilty as the next person of that. But it's being mindful and conscious of when you're doing that. And that's what I can do. I can see it and name it and own it, and that's okay. And I think a lot of people can't. And that's when it becomes problematic, because it starts to erode mental health. It starts to erode physical health. It starts to creep over into the relationships that we've got within our lives.
Yeah.
And that's when it becomes really problematic.
No, definitely. And I think as well with trauma, and like you said, we all might kind of adopt those coping resources, whatever it might be, scrolling on our phone, going on social media, hands up. I definitely do that as well. And like you said, it's acknowledging it, but also that compassionate piece is huge, not shaming yourself for doing that, because that, escalates the situation. And actually, we are just human, we're human beings. And if you've been programmed that way for so long, if that's been your coping mechanism for 10, 20, 30 years, then you can't just expect to kind of suddenly one day wake up and not do it anymore. It takes
Yeah.
work, it takes practice, but it's being compassionate with yourself every time that it might slip a little bit, and that's okay. Like, we're just human at the end of the day. We make mistakes, that's fine. And like I said, it's being compassionate, it's having that self-love and understanding, it's my body's actually only doing this to kind of, keep me alive. This is a coping mechanism that I've adapted for so long just to be able to survive in this world and the experiences that have been thrown at me at life. And I think if you see it like that, from that compassionate point of view, you don't be so hard on yourself. You're just like, you know what? Okay, I'll do the bit of online shopping if I want to, or I'll eat the takeaway that I have tonight. That's fine. That's going to be me today. And that's all I can kind of do to kind of help myself.
Absolutely. And also, why it's so powerful is that has the ability to fundamentally change relationships within your life as well. Because if you can offer yourself that level of compassion and understanding, then actually you're better able to offer that to other people as well. So then you can support them with whatever they're dealing with. And one of the things
Yeah.
that you've spoken about a couple of times is giving space for your authentic self to come through. That's been part of your journey, I think, alongside compassion. And I'd love to understand a little bit more, because again, it's another term that we hear a lot. What does authenticity mean to Libby?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for me, it's like taking the mask off that maybe you've been allocated or assigned your whole life or for how many years, and understanding that, you know, those conditionings behind that. So for me, I feel like the past 10, 15 years of my life, I was conditioned to believe or think a certain way about myself. And therefore, that kind of drove me to the certain decisions that I made throughout my life, throughout my career, the types of behaviors that I adopted, whether that be perfectionism, whether that be kind of people pleasing, whether that be needing a sense of approval from others. And actually, it's when you start to realize where they've come from, where those kind of irrational beliefs have come from, where they stemmed from, what is the root of them, and actually kind of like detangling them, taking them apart and being like, you know what, this is not Libby. This is not authentically me and how I want to show up. It's almost like this visage, this mask that I'm putting on that allows me to fit in to the world quite easily and play small, not stand out, just fit in into a kind of little box. And I think, I kind of started to really piece together that 2, 3, 4 years ago. And then it was understanding, well, if that's kind of been the conditionings that I've been made to believe about myself for so many years, who is this girl now? Who is Libby now? That's how I see authenticity. It's kind of just breaking the reins of those conditionings for so long that you've had.
I love it. It's like what you've spoken about, this most beautiful journey that you're on. What are you bringing with you on this journey? What are you hoping for?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think for me, it's one of my key values is like being courageous. And I think for so long, because I've lived in a very perfectionist state, I've been quite scared of like making mistakes. And I've had to kind of put across this like perfect image. Yeah. That is so abnormal. It's just not the norm. Like, no one is perfect. We all have our flaws, and that's absolutely fine. But I think it's been showing up courageously and not fearing making mistakes. Like, that's something that moving forward, I really want to kind of implement in my life and actually make decisions for me, not based on others' kind of external expectations or their opinions of what I should do. It needs to feel good for me. It needs to resonate with me. It needs to kind of sit well with where I'm at and what I want to do. So I think that's a big part of what I want to take forward. And I think for me, it's just like, it's living in that state of flow, like being happy and being joyful. And that's not based on, accolades or whatever it might be. It's just living authentically and finding the joy in the small things. And I think a massive part of that realization has been, my health. And I know we haven't mentioned it in the podcast so far, but 3 years ago, I became really unwell. Physically, I was in and out of hospital. I was diagnosed with kind of 2 autoimmune conditions. And I think that was a kind of clear presentation, a physical presentation of what was going on internally. My body was kind of burning out. I was living inauthentically. I wasn't living in alignment with who I wanted to be and what my values how they wanted to kind of show up as well. And that therefore then resulted in illness and in quite serious illness. And at the time, I was devastated. I was just like, I can't do my PhD anymore. Like, I had to take 6 months out. All these things that I thought were part of my identity and my self-worth, I had to let go of in that moment. And, that time was mentally a very dark place, physically and mentally, but it made me realize, it kind of brought myself back home to who I was, because I really had to start from the bottom and be like, this is not, who I am anymore. And actually, again, like untangle that. So that's been a huge caveat in my journey of like this realization of what is important in my life, and my health will always come first. I think, now for me, if an opportunity or a certain relationship, whatever it might be, is not in alignment with making me feel good physically and mentally and in alignment with optimal well-being, then I won't commit to it, because I've been down that route before and it ended in a bad place. That's something that I would always prioritize now moving forward, is being in good health.
And I can see why, even more so now, the connection to you said your mind, body, and soul connection earlier on was so important. And like, without that, it would be really difficult to live what you're talking about. You can only do what's right for your mental and physical health if you're connected to your body and you actually know what it needs and you take the cues from it. So, we have a closing tradition on this podcast.
Yes.
I like to ask each of my guests, what is one thing that other people value that you do not?
Yeah. So I think as a society, what I see is a collective value, I guess, that society promotes this kind of like urgency culture, this like burnout culture, this productivity culture, right? Of productivity or kind of effectiveness means that you have to put in 12-hour days, you have to be grinding yourself to the absolute rock bottom. You're almost rewarded for that, in society. The more you put in, the more you're going to get out. And for me, I really struggle with that, because we've alluded to it in the chat earlier, but like how important rest is, you know, not only for like physical and mental well-being, but like for creativity, for productivity in the workplace as well. And I see that a lot of the time it's like these big organizations, they promote this culture where you're almost shamed if you don't put in 12-hour days, or you don't, you know, you're not in work late, or you're not being with your family on the weekends because you're working. Like that's normally given a gold star. And I think that's really wrong.
Well, on that note, I am going to say thank you so much for coming on to Great Conversations and sharing your wisdom. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, Libby. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. I'd like to thank the humans that make the Great Conversations podcast possible. My editor, Jovan Stojkovski, Jamie Jenkin, who made the lovely music that you're hearing now, and my guests for their willingness to share their personal stories. If you haven't already, please rate and follow the podcast. It's a great way to show your support and allows me to keep bringing on extraordinary guests. Sending you so much love. Bye for now.